where the quietest moments often carry the loudest truths. Have you ever tried to make someone better, only to realize, maybe they weren't broken to begin with? Maybe what they needed wasn't your help, just your pause. Today's story doesn't have a grand rescue, a dramatic confession, or even a single raised voice. It begins with a child saying 5 words, and ends with a waitress nodding wordlessly, as a billionaire father loses something he never thought he'd have to give up, the right to fix. If you've ever been told that silence means doing nothing, this story might change your mind. So before we begin, hit like, click subscribe, and stay with us through the end. Because today, nobody saves the day. And yet, everything changes. The restaurant was quiet in the way expensive places often are, not silent, but cushioned. The clink of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the muffled footfalls of servers on polished floors. Golden lights floated above each table like halos, casting warm pools over imported dishes and hand-stitched napkins. Everything was positioned, planned, composed. At the far end of the room sat a man who believed in composition more than most. Richard Kane, 63, tech billionaire, former engineer turned systems philosopher, had built his empire on a single idea: everything can be optimized. Schedules, algorithms, company culture, public image, even human behavior. Especially behavior. He adjusted the world like a chessboard, believing every move had a better move. And tonight, sitting across from his 9-year-old son, he saw something out of place. Owen Kane was an unusual child in the eyes of most people, though the word unusual was never used around him. Sensitive to light. Startled by sharp sounds. Insistent on patterns that made no sense to others, but perfect sense to him. Diagnosed with sensory processing disorder 2 years ago, Owen had taught his father 100 new definitions of the word normal. Tonight, he sat with a small box of colored pencils beside his plate, organizing the silverware into a geometric sequence that made him visibly calm. Fork, spoon, knife, rotated slightly, aligned to imaginary axes that only he could see. A plate of pasta arrived, placed gently by a waitress who offered no small talk. She was young, early 30s maybe, with a patient calmness not often seen in service. Leah. That was the name on her tag. What Richard didn't know, and what mattered more than her name, was that she used to be a behavioral therapist. Used to be. She had left that job not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because she could no longer stomach what pressure often meant: fixing children without asking if they wanted to be fixed. As Leah walked away, Richard noticed something. The plate wasn't aligned with Owen's arrangement. It was crooked, maybe 10 degrees off the axis of the utensils. To Richard, this wasn't just messy. It was an obstacle. A problem to solve. Without thinking, he reached across the table. Just a slight motion to nudge the plate into place. A tiny fix, harmless, he thought. Owen's hand shot out like a spring. Small fingers wrapped around Richard's wrist, not violently, not even forcefully, but firmly. It was a child's hand, but the message behind it carried the weight of a full-grown truth. "Don't fix me," Owen said. The words weren't loud. He didn't shout. He didn't whine. He simply stated it, the way someone might state the time or the weather, not to argue, but to inform. Richard froze. Leah, halfway to another table with a tray of sparkling waters, stopped mid-step. She had heard it. Her eyes moved slightly, just enough to register what had happened, but she didn't say a word. She didn't turn back. She didn't intervene. She stood there for a beat, maybe 2. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Not to Owen. Not to Richard. Just to herself, maybe. And kept walking. Richard slowly pulled his hand back, unsure what surprised him more, his son's words, or how much they pierced. Across the room, a couple at the next table glanced over. One of them whispered something, "That boy's strange." It wasn't cruel. Just the kind of casual judgment people offer when they see a pattern they don't understand. Richard heard it. But for the first time in a long time, He didn't have a response. No correction. No polished defense of neurodivergence. No corporate jargon about inclusion. He just sat there, staring at the slightly tilted plate, and the child who refused to let it be corrected. Owen exhaled, slow and steady, and resumed lining up the pencils beside his breadstick. As if nothing had happened. As if everything had happened. And in a way, everything had. Richard didn't move. His hand still hovered just inches above the plate, as if frozen mid-function, like a cursor left blinking in a paused line of code. He had reached to help. To adjust. To improve. And instead, he had been stopped not by defiance, but by clarity. Don't fix me. The words still rang in his ears, soft but absolute. Leah returned then, a tray balanced effortlessly in her left hand. She approached their table without expression, as though nothing unusual had happened. Without meeting anyone's gaze, she gently placed 2 glasses of water on the table. One for Owen, set down with exact precision. One for Richard, just slightly offset. She did not smile. She did not acknowledge the tension. She did not ask if everything was okay. She simply paused, just long enough for her presence to be felt. Then, with a subtle breath and the smallest of nods, not to anyone in particular, she turned and walked away. There was something in that nod that unsettled Richard more than the boy's words had. It wasn't approval. It wasn't defiance. It was acknowledgement. As if Leah had recognized something private, something sacred, and chosen not to interfere. Richard blinked. Owen, meanwhile, let out a soft breath, a signal, a release. The kind of exhale that says, "I'm safe now." He returned to his colored pencils and quietly resumed aligning a spoon beside the fork, checking angles with a care usually reserved for architects. He didn't glance up. Didn't speak. Didn't seem shaken at all. Across the room, someone whispered again. "Strange little kid," a woman said to her dinner partner, her tone not unkind but unmistakably distant, as if placing a polite boundary around something unfamiliar. Richard heard it. He didn't flinch. Didn't snap back with one of his sharp, rehearsed lines about innovation or neurodiversity or the cost of genius. Instead, he stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He just slowly rose from his chair, his napkin still folded in his hand, and let his eyes follow Leah as she moved across the dining room. She was graceful, professional, unobtrusive, the kind of waitress no one remembers until she does something unforgettable. But she had done nothing. That was the point. She hadn't leaned down with a cooing voice. She hadn't crouched beside Owen to explain away his difference. She hadn't offered tips or warnings or reassurances. She hadn't even looked at Richard to silently ask for permission. She had simply let it be. And in doing so, she had created a space, a pause, that no one else had ever given him before. Richard stayed standing longer than made sense. He didn't know why. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was recalibrating. Maybe he was just unaccustomed to being rendered unnecessary. A server passed by with a plate of lamb. The scent was rich, heavy with rosemary. A wine glass clinked softly nearby. Life resumed around him, indifferent. Still, Richard didn't sit. At the table, Owen reached for his water glass with his left hand, not his dominant one, and sipped. He didn't spill. He didn't fuss. He placed it back on the table slightly out of line with the utensils, but didn't seem to care. He adjusted a napkin instead, folding one corner inward, making a triangle. Then another. Then another. He was building something. It didn't need explaining. Richard looked down at his son, not to study him, not to evaluate. Just to see. There was nothing broken. Nothing wrong. Nothing that needed improving. There was just a child, being. And a waitress, gone. And a silence that felt oddly full. Leah moved through the dining room with quiet precision, her footsteps measured, her presence minimal. She didn't seek acknowledgement and didn't expect it. That moment at the cane table, The boy's words, the father's silence, was already fading into the hum of another Friday night dinner service. But it hadn't gone unnoticed. A few minutes later, just as she finished delivering 2 orders of sea bass to a couple near the windows, she felt a shift in the room's energy. She turned to see the restaurant manager approaching from the host's podium, shoulders tight, brow pinched, eyes darting toward table 17. "Leah," he said, low but firm. "Can I have a word?" She followed him behind the service counter, into the corner where servers sometimes paused to catch their breath between courses. The clatter of the kitchen and the murmured chatter of patrons created a sound barrier just thin enough to pretend this wasn't a reprimand. The manager, Robert Marlin, 45, pressed shirt always a bit too crisp, adjusted his cuff as if trying to polish his authority. "You need to be more proactive," he said without preamble. "That guest, Richard Kane, he's not the kind of man who appreciates passivity." Leah didn't blink. Passivity. "You saw what happened at the table." "The kid," he caught himself, lowering his voice further. The boy was clearly reacting. "You just stood there." "I served water," she replied calmly. "You didn't intervene." "No," she said. "I didn't." Robert sighed, exasperated. "Look, I know you have your ways, and I respect your background. But this place has a rhythm, an image. We keep things clean, smooth. Guests like him expect us to manage awkward situations. Not stand there like furniture." Leah's eyes met his squarely now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step forward. But her stillness took up space. "I'm not here to fix him," she said. "I'm here to make sure no one breaks him." The words landed with a clarity that unsettled more than any defense would have. There was no flinch in her posture, no apology in her tone. Just a truth she had learned the hard way, and one she wasn't about to betray. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Maybe he wanted to argue. Maybe he didn't know how. There was something final about Leah's voice, not stubborn, but grounded. Like someone who had seen too much pretending and decided silence was the last kind of respect still in stock. He gave a small nod, barely perceptible, then turned away without a word. Leah remained standing for a few moments more, her breath steady, her fingers loosely curled by her sides. She didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a win. It was just necessary. Because she remembered the years in clinical rooms, the laminated charts, the endless checklists, the well-meaning corrections, the endless stream of better ifs. Better if he made eye contact. Better if he stopped stimmying. Better if he responded to his name on the first try. Better if he sounded more like them. And now, working in a restaurant, of all places, she'd found a truth few therapy rooms had ever taught her. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone is not intervene. Let them be strange. Let them arrange their silverware. Let them say "don't fix me," and believe they mean it. She returned to the floor, picking up her tray, her shoulders light despite the weight it carried. The tables were where she'd left them. The candles still flickered. The world, for all its noise, hadn't noticed what nearly broke. But she had. And she wouldn't be the one to break it. Richard returned to the table slowly, as if each step carried more than his weight. The buzz of conversation in the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, laughter from one corner, the scrape of a chair in another, but around their table, the air still felt heavier. Owen hadn't moved much. He was still arranging the silverware, still immersed in a logic that belonged only to him. There was no urgency, no anxiety, just quiet concentration, as if the world made more sense when it could be reordered at a 45-degree angle. Richard sat down. No words. No sigh. Just the soft creak of a chair yielding to gravity. Across the table, Owen glanced up. Briefly. His face was unreadable, not blank, but unconcerned with being interpreted. He wasn't seeking approval. Wasn't asking for connection. He was simply making sure the space he occupied remained untouched. Then he spoke. Calm. Level. "It's okay if it looks wrong," he said. "It looks right to me." There was no defiance in his voice. No sarcasm. Just a quiet truth delivered as a gift. Not wrapped, not demanded, just offered. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, all the systems he had spent a lifetime perfecting, the frameworks, the models, the processes, they meant nothing. His son wasn't a variable to be managed. Wasn't an outlier to be corrected. He was a fixed point that refused to be pulled into orbit. Richard looked at the plate, still misaligned. The utensils, off-center. The napkin, slightly wrinkled, folded in a way that made no sense. And then he looked at Owen, completely still. Not anxious. Not bothered. Just right. He reached for the napkin on his side of the table. Not to straighten it. Not to fix anything. He simply picked it up and held it in his hand. It was a gesture without a destination. He didn't wipe his mouth. Didn't adjust his tie. He just held the napkin, like a placeholder for every response he didn't know how to make. Because what do you say to a child who doesn't need your solution? What do you offer to someone who is not asking for change? The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, the kind of silence that invites you to sit with what you don't understand. Richard let it happen. He didn't push. Didn't pivot. Didn't reach for a metaphor or a strategy. He simply sat across from his son and watched him build order out of a pattern that no algorithm could predict. Maybe this was the lesson. Not in the words, but in the space between them. And for once, he didn't try to fill it. The meal ended without ceremony. Plates half finished. Glasses sweating with condensation. The air had shifted, not in temperature, but in weight. Something had been lifted, or maybe something had finally settled. Richard wasn't sure. Owen stood next to the table now, clutching a folded napkin in both hands. He didn't seem in a hurry, nor did he look bored. He simply existed in the afterspace, that quiet zone between experience and departure, where children often wait for adults to catch up. Leah appeared near the edge of the dining room, checking on another table. Her movements were as calm as ever, but something in her presence felt deliberate, almost respectful, like she understood that silence sometimes deserved to be left untouched. Richard raised a hand, gently, and met her eyes. She walked over, not quickly, not hesitantly. Just, with ease. "Excuse me," he said softly, as Owen wandered a few feet away, absorbed in the folds of his napkin. "Can I ask you something?" Leah stopped at a polite distance. She didn't smile, but her face was open. "Of course." Richard hesitated, just long enough to show this wasn't a casual question. "You don't think I should guide him a bit more?" he asked. "Give him some structure? Direction?" His tone wasn't critical. Not anymore. It was uncertain but not defensive, the voice of someone sincerely asking, perhaps for the first time, if less might actually be more. Leah looked at him, quiet for a moment. Then, without tilting her head or softening her gaze, she said, "He's not lost. He just doesn't want your map." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't philosophical. It was simply a truth, dropped gently, like a pebble in still water. Richard didn't respond immediately. His instinct, the one that usually leapt to challenge or reframe, stayed still. He felt something settle in his chest. Not defeat. Not resignation. Acceptance. He nodded once. Not out of agreement, exactly. But out of recognition. Leah gave a single, almost imperceptible breath and stepped back. She didn't linger. Didn't wait for praise or thanks. She turned and returned to her rhythm, letting the moment rest where it belonged, between them, untouched. Richard looked over at his son. Owen had made a paper triangle, now balancing it on the tip of his finger like a sail. There was no goal in sight. No finish line. Just movement. Just shape. Just him. And for the first time in a long while, Richard didn't reach for anything. Not control. Not clarity. He let the map stay folded in his pocket. Later that night, Richard sat in his home office, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across a room lined with precision. Every item had a purpose. Every book, shelved by theme and color. Every cable, clipped and tucked. The air smelled faintly of cedar and order. But something inside him didn't match the room anymore. He opened a folder on his desktop labeled Owen_Therapy_Suite. It was a file he had built over months, a comprehensive roadmap of sensory integration protocols, motor coordination tasks, and behavioral scaffolding. He'd consulted with top specialists, spent hours reading medical journals, watching lectures, annotating case studies. He had built it the way he built everything, with the belief that structure could fix what was out of line. Clicking into a subfolder, he found a document titled Fine Motor Correction Plan, Rev. 6. It opened slowly, heavy with formatting and charts. As the text filled the screen, his eyes landed on a familiar section. Hand Pattern Realignment Exercises, Level 2. He scrolled down, slowly, reading instructions for correcting lateral finger drift, wrist tension, pen grip modification. The language was clinical, efficient, a map through the maze. His hand hovered over the trackpad, scrolling until he reached the final segment. Then he stopped. For a full minute, he just stared at the blinking cursor, his mind replaying 5 words from earlier that night. Don't fix me. He exhaled. Then moved the cursor back to the top. Delete. No hesitation. No backup save. No dragging to a review folder. He deleted the entire document, and then the entire folder. It didn't feel like failure. It felt like release. He leaned back, letting his chair creak under the unfamiliar weight of surrender. Then, almost by instinct, he opened another folder. One he hadn't clicked in months, Owen_Art. Inside were scanned images, hundreds of them, from over the years. Crayon sketches. Lopsided figures. Scribbled letters dancing off margins. Color combinations that made no sense to anyone but the boy who made them. He clicked through them slowly. One image caught his eye. A page filled with backward letters, drawn in looping red and green, arranged in a spiral pattern around a stick figure with a tilted crown. It was messy. Unbalanced. Nothing about it aligned. And yet, it held something true. Not about art. About freedom. Richard stared at it longer than he intended. Then, for the first time, he hit print. The machine whirred, and the page emerged, warm and imperfect. He placed it on his desk. Normally, he would straighten the corners, trim the edges, maybe even laminate it. Tonight, he didn't. He took a single piece of tape and stuck it to the wall beside his monitor, not centered. Not leveled. Just there. Off to the side. Crooked. Real. It didn't feel like giving up. It felt like finally listening. He sat there for a long while, watching the page ripple slightly in the breeze from the air vent, the spiral of letters dancing with each breath of the house. And for the first time in years, he didn't need the drawing to mean something. He just needed it to be. 1 week later, Richard parked in front of the restaurant again. The valet recognized him and gave a polite nod, but Richard declined the service. He preferred to walk this time. Not out of habit, but out of something else, something quieter. Owen walked beside him, clutching a small paper square folded into a triangle. It wasn't origami. It wasn't anything, really. Just something to hold. They stepped inside. The same golden lights glowed from above, the same hushed ambience, the same pristine rhythm of forks and wine and barely audible music. But something felt missing. They were seated at the same table. Table 17. A different waitress came over this time. Smiling, cheerful, efficient. She poured water, handed menus, offered the specials of the day. Then she disappeared politely, like she was trained to do. Owen didn't open the menu. He never did. He placed the paper triangle on the table and began aligning the utensils, not quite as he had before, but close. The spoon turned slightly to the left. The fork nudged sideways. The knife tilted at an angle that made no sense to anyone else. Richard didn't touch a thing. Owen looked up, searching the room. Then asked plainly she left. Richard followed his gaze, already knowing who she was. Yes, he said. Then paused. No. She let us leave. That's not the same. Owen nodded once, without asking more. He didn't need an explanation. And Richard, for once, didn't feel the need to give one. The table settled into silence. It wasn't awkward. It was full. No grand revelations. No lessons exchanged. Just the hum of the room around them, and two people sitting across from each other, one folding the corner of a napkin, the other watching without evaluation. The waitress came and went, checking on other tables. She didn't hover. She didn't notice the utensils. She didn't comment on Owen's method. And still, something about this particular table felt different. Maybe it was the stillness, or the space, or the absence of fixing. Richard leaned back slightly, letting his hand rest on the table near Owen's without crossing into his space. He wasn't performing patience. He wasn't demonstrating growth. He was just there. Outside, people passed along the sidewalk, lit by soft lamps and their own conversations. Inside, this small pocket of quiet stretched outward like a ripple that refused to disappear. Owen placed his triangle in the center of his plate. Not because it belonged there. Just because it felt right. Richard didn't adjust it. And for the first time, the table didn't need to be perfect to feel complete. Sometimes, the most profound form of love is knowing when not to interfere. We live in a world that tells us improvement is always the goal. That with the right tools, training, or discipline, we can fix anything, our homes, our schedules, even our children. But some things, especially human beings, aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be witnessed, understood, accepted as they are. In this story, a wealthy father, Richard, who built his life around optimization and control, confronts a truth that no system can prepare him for. His son doesn't need fixing. The boy doesn't need to be made better. He needs to be allowed to be himself, without correction, without shame, without redirection masked as love. For older audiences, those of us who've spent a lifetime guiding, correcting, advising, this can be an uncomfortable idea. We were taught to teach, to lead, to shape the next generation. And yes, sometimes, that's still necessary. But there are moments, sacred ones, where wisdom means stepping back. Where silence says, I trust you. Where stillness says, you are enough, even if I don't fully understand you. One of the most powerful lines in the story comes from the waitress, Leah, who chooses not to intervene when the boy asserts his autonomy. When challenged by her manager, she says, I'm not here to fix him. I'm here to make sure no one breaks him. That single line shifts the entire emotional gravity of the story. It reminds us that restraint can be an act of protection, that respect sometimes looks like doing nothing, even when everything in us wants to act. And Richard's eventual transformation, throwing away carefully crafted therapy plans, keeping a crooked drawing just as it was, shows us that healing doesn't always look like solutions. Sometimes, it looks like surrendering our own ego, our belief that we know best. For those of us in later stages of life, this story is a quiet invitation to reflect not only on how we guide others, but how we let go, how we listen, how we allow others to walk their own paths, even if they don't use the map we drew for them. Because love isn't about changing someone into what we hoped they'd be. It's about seeing them clearly, and deciding they don't need to change at all. If you've ever tried to fix someone, to make them fit better, act neater, seem more like everyone else, but one day, you realized the most beautiful thing about them was that they were already whole, just as they were. Then remember this. Not fixing someone can be the deepest way to show they're not broken to you. Who was the one who let you be right when the world tried to change you?